we'll deal with obstructions, which are artificial objects. As you can tell, there are two different types of obstructions, those that are movable and those that are immovable. So first, how to take relief from a movable obstruction. The first point is that a player is entitled to relief from, or generally entitled to relief from, obstructions, because these are items that in an ideal world perhaps would not be on the course. A player may take relief from a movable obstruction as follows, and this procedure depends as to whether the ball lies in or on the obstruction or simply near the obstruction. But if the ball is not in or on the obstruction, so this could be a case where the ball is against the obstruction, so you lean up against the bunker rake, or it could be the bunker rake is several inches away, or it could be that a hazard stake is 10 feet away but on the player's line of play. The obstruction may be removed. If the ball moves, it must be replaced. There's no penalty for moving the ball as long as the movement of the ball is directly attributable to the removal of the obstruction. So there's that phrase again that we saw in Rule 20. So in other words, let's say if the ball is resting against the bunker rake, and when you lift the bunker rake, that causes the ball to roll over, then obviously that's directly attributable, so no penalty to replace the ball. But let's say the bunker rake is 6 inches away from the ball, player's going up to lift the bunker rake, and he accidentally kicks his ball, then the ball's movement is not directly attributable to the lifting of the rake, so it would be one penalty stroke under Rule 18-2A, and the ball would be replaced. Now it gets a little more involved when the ball actually lies in or on the obstruction. For example, let's say the ball lies on a towel left by a spectator. Let's say it lies on a piece of paper, whatever the case may be. The ball may be lifted and the obstruction removed. Note there's no requirement to mark the position of the ball. Through the green or in a hazard, the ball must be dropped, and underline that word dropped, or on the putting green be placed as near as possible to the spot directly under the place where the ball lay in or on the obstruction, but not near the hole. And the key there is to remember that in such a case the player will drop the ball, that he will not place it. Sometimes people will make the mistake and have the player place it, but he will drop the ball if the ball was originally on the obstruction. Now, the last paragraph, which we've touched on a little bit, when a ball's in motion, an obstruction that might, not that in fact does, but that might influence the movement of the ball must not be moved. There are exceptions to that equipment of any player may be moved while a ball's in motion, and the flagstick, when the flagstick is being attended, moved, or held up, may be moved while a ball's in motion. So basically, when a flagstick is unattended, it may not be moved while a ball's in motion. So if I hit my putt too hard, and it looks like it might strike Bill's sand wedge line on the green, he can rush over and lift his wedge. And what if it looks like it might strike my wedge? Could he run over and lift my wedge too? The answer is yes. All right, so now on to immovable obstructions. So these are obstructions that are not readily movable and that will require the player to drop away from them. And it starts off by defining what interference is. And we'll see that Rule 24-2 and Rule 25-1, which deals with relief from abnormal ground conditions, are very, very similar. They're not quite identical, but they are very similar. Each rule starts off by defining when a player has interference, because that determines when a player is entitled to take relief under this rule. Interference occurs when a ball lies in or on the obstruction, or when the obstruction interferes with the player's stance or area of intended swing. And if the ball is on the putting green, interference also occurs if the obstruction intervenes on his line of putt. Otherwise, I mean off the putting green, intervention on the line of play is not interference. So if you have a, let's say, a permanent protective fence 10 yards ahead of you, that just because it's on your line of play, you do not have interference under this rule. So once it's determined that a player has interference, here's how he'll go about taking relief. And the relief procedures will depend as to the part of the course on which the ball lies. First point is that there is no relief if the ball lies in a water hazard. So if the ball's in a water hazard and let's say a drain pipe or a culvert interferes with the player's play, no relief. Player either has to play the ball from the hazard or with a penalty stroke take relief under the water hazard rule. If the ball lies through the green, which is the most common situation, player must lift the ball and drop it, meaning the original ball, within 1 club length of and not nearer the hole than the nearest point of relief. And remember the definition of nearest point of relief that we went over last month. The nearest point of relief can't be in a hazard, can't be on a putting green. And when the ball is dropped within that 1 club length area, the ball must first strike a part of the course at a spot that avoids interference by the immovable obstruction and is not in a hazard and not on a putting green. So one point that's interesting, and it's a little bit of an academic point, but it's something to be aware of, is that let's say the player is taking relief, especially with a small obstruction like a sprinkler head. And normally his 1 club length drop area will be close to a semicircle within which he can drop. But that does not necessarily mean that every spot within that 1 club length semicircle is an acceptable place to drop. And if you can picture, for example, player playing from bottom to top, and he's determined the nearest point of relief is immediately behind the sprinkler head. So imagine the one semicircle with a radius of 1 club length, that as you're looking at it and as a right-handed player, every spot, especially on there may be a few spots on the right-hand side of that semicircle where he cannot drop the ball. Because if he were to drop the ball, let's say toward the right side of that semicircle, where the ball landed at that spot, his left foot might be on the sprinkler head. And that means not only is not an acceptable place to play from, but that's not an acceptable place for the ball first to strike a part of the course. Is that where the ball first strikes a part of the course, there must be no interference and must satisfy all of these requirements. So there can be part, and it's difficult, because as an official in a spot like that, often you say, okay, drop within 1 club length, and it didn't roll to a spot covered by 20-2C, looks good. Well, in 99% of the cases, that's going to be true. But every now and then, there could be a case where the player dropped within that 1 club length, but there's some spots within that 1 club length that were not acceptable places for him to drop the ball. So just a little something to be aware of.
Now, what you're saying is the reference point then is he drops in that semicircle, it hits the ground. That's the point where if he were to stand, even though the ball moved a club length and a half, if he were to have replaced it there for some reason, and he would be standing on the sprinkler head, that wasn't a proper drop, even though it moved into a position that satisfied all the other requirements.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Phil. But even though the tendency for everyone is to look at where the ball finished and say, okay, that looks okay. But where you also have to look at is where the ball first struck a part of the course. Did it satisfy all that requirements? And that's important, because imagine, for example, if the answer were different, and that if a player were to drop a ball twice on that spot and then have to place it under 20-2C, and then he'd be placing it in a spot where he had interference, which doesn't make any sense. So just a little something to be aware of. In a bunker, and then this is what, especially these next few rules we'll go over, are good examples of how, hopefully, with the cooperation of the weather, our 2 seminars in late April will be helpful, because situations like this are a little difficult just to talk about around the table, and And for a lot of people, they make a lot more sense once you actually start dropping balls on the course and putting tees down on the ground and so forth. In a bunker. So if the ball is in a bunker, the player is entitled to relief. Let's say there's a drain in the bunker, maybe steps in or near the bunker. And the player has two options. Without penalty, drop in accordance with the clause we just discussed, except the nearest point of relief has to be in the bunker and the ball must be dropped in the bunker, or with a penalty stroke to drop outside the bunker, keeping the point where the ball lay between the hole and the spot on which the ball is dropped. So one option with penalty inside the bunker, one option without penalty inside the bunker, one option with penalty outside the bunker. On the putting green, and occasionally you'll see a sprinkler head on a putting green, or on a really large green you might see a drain, or maybe a sprinkler head close to the middle of the putting green. If the ball lies on the putting green, the player must lift the ball and place it without penalty at the nearest point of relief. So there's no one club length on the putting green. You place it at the nearest point of relief. And in some cases, that nearest point of relief might be off the putting green. On the teeing ground, so let's say a player hits a tee shot, strikes a tree, comes back to rest inside the teeing ground, which is not through the green, and he's standing on a sprinkler head. He would take relief as if his ball lay through the green. The exception, and we've already talked about a couple of examples of this in previous sessions. A player may not take relief under this rule if interference by anything other than an immovable obstruction makes the stroke clearly impracticable. So an example, a player's ball is wedged between two very big tree roots. If he were to play the ball, he'd be standing on a cart path. This would say no relief. Another way to look at it is to say, okay, if the cart path were not there, what would the player do? Well, the player would deem the ball unplayable. Okay, in that case, he's not going to get lucky under this rule. Now, second part of the exception is that there's no relief if interference by the obstruction would occur only through use of a clearly unreasonable stroke or an unnecessarily abnormal swing or direction of play. So let's look at two examples of that. Let's say that there is a tree. Let's say that a player's ball is near a tree, and no, actually, let's say that there's no tree. Let's say a player's ball is in the fairway in a divot hole. He's a right-handed player, and for him to play his stroke right-handed, except for the divot hole, no problem. But he doesn't like the fact that he's in a divot hole, so he says, I'm really going to play this left-hand. Look, when I play it left-handed, I'm standing on the sprinkler head. So this will say, sorry, you do not get relief, because that abnormal stance, the left-hand stroke, was not necessary given the circumstances. Now let's change the facts. Now there is a tree. Player's ball is to the right of a tree in between the tree and a cart path. And he says, well, gee, because of this tree, I'm going to have to turn my 5-iron over and hit this left-handed. And look, when I hit it left-handed, I'm staying on the cart path. So would that player get relief? Yeah. Answer to that's yes, because again, as an official, a good way to look at it is to say, okay, if the cart path were not there, what would the player do? And if the answer is, well, he'd still hit it left-handed, because that's the only way he could hit it because of the tree, then he gets relief. So the next question is, how does he go about taking relief in that case? And what he'll do, how will he determine his nearest point of relief? He will determine it for the left-hand stroke. And then he'll take relief for the left-hand stroke, and then after he takes relief, let's say he somehow gets to the other side of the tree and can play it right-handed. Is that okay?
Sure.
Sure. But he needs to make sure that ultimately he winds up with relief for the left-hand stroke.
John, in your scenario of this ball in a depression, divot hole, or whatever it says, and the player says he wants to play it left-handed, but he's not entitled to it. Well, why is he not entitled?
No, well, he may play it left-handed. It's just that he's not going to be entitled to relief from a sprinkler head.
Why not?
Well, because the reason is, in that case, he's a right-handed player, and the only reason he's using a left-handed stroke is to reach a position where he has interference from the
What
sprinkler
if he
head.
feels that the only way I can get that ball out of there is by left-handed, because that's the way I practiced it all my life?
Well, if he can convince you as an official that if that sprinkler head were not there, that he would, in fact, play it left-handed, then yeah, he gets relief.
And then you watch them.
All right, let's see. On with 24-3, which covers the procedure when a ball is in an obstruction, whether movable or immovable, but it hasn't been found, how the player may proceed. And first, we'll deal with the ball in a movable obstruction. And the main point, or the first starting point of each of these, is determining whether it is, in fact, known or virtually certain that the ball is in the obstruction. If we assume once that's determined, then this is how the player will go about taking relief. With a movable obstruction, the player may substitute another ball. Let's see, you must remove the obstruction. So let's say we're talking about perhaps a trash receptacle. And through the green or on a hazard, drop a ball, or on the putting green, place a ball as near as possible to the spot directly under the place where the ball last crossed the outermost limits of the movable obstruction. So what does that mean? Well, imagine it's a big trash can that the reference point will be where the ball last crossed the outermost limits. So look at the path the ball took into it and where it crossed the outermost limit of trash can. That's the reference point, and the player will drop the ball underneath that spot. Now, if a ball is in an immovable obstruction and can't be found, for example, it's been hit into a building or it goes down a drain or something like that, and it's known or virtually certain that the ball is in the obstruction, then the reference point for taking relief is going to be similar to what we just saw. It's where the ball last crossed the outermost limits of the obstruction, and then the ball is going to deemed to lie at that spot. And once you determine that, then you just take normal relief. Say, okay, if I found my ball, and if it did in fact lie at this spot where the ball last, say at the door to the building, where the ball last crossed the outermost limits, then how would I go about taking relief if the ball did in fact lie here? And the player would follow the same procedure. Now, where this gets interesting is with water hazards, because remember, if your ball lies in a water hazard, you do not get relief from an immovable obstruction, even if that obstruction lies outside the hazard. And look at it the other way. If your ball lies outside the water hazard, but you have interference from an immovable obstruction inside the hazard, you do get relief. So the key is where the ball lies and not where the obstruction is. And let's look at culverts, and you have the one in the bank of a water hazard, the ball goes into it. Then the ball goes beyond the hazard line, so the ball clearly lies through the green, say under the fairway. In one case, you find the ball in the culvert. You know, you can see it in there. You might be even to retrieve it, but you can see and identify that it's yours. Then, what's the ruling? You get relief. Your ball actually lies through the green, so you get relief, and you go straight up to take relief. But now you have a situation where the ball enters the culvert in the water hazard, but comes to rest somewhere through the green, but you can't find it. You can't find or identify the ball. So the ball's lost in the obstruction. So what's your reference point in that case? Where it entered, which is also in the water hazard. And so now you say, okay, let's pretend that my ball lies here at the entrance to the culvert in the water hazard. And if that's the case, then no relief, which is a tough break.
John, that ruling was like 84, 88 was changed at Augusta on the 13th hole, and Gary Player had a fall and the bridge that crosses over, and being a immovable obstruction, and he was granted relief and proceeded to hit up, make birdie, and win the tournament. And then subsequently, at the next rule session, it was changed to disallow.
Yeah, I think it was. I want to say it was 88, because I think 84 you're still entitled to relief. I could be wrong, but anyway, Gary Player's last Masters win I think was in 78. So I don't think it was a direct result of one specific incident. I think it was a number of things. In fact, I remember a ruling at the playoff at Colonial in Fort Worth with maybe Jim Colbert around 83, 84, where I think he got a really great break from a bridge. And after a while, the USGA and RNA just said, look, if your ball's in a water hazard, it's pretty normal for the ball to be unplayable. Let's not let a player get a great break, and let's just keep it simple.
Is there a reason why under 24 that they don't talk about just having an option to play your provisional ball if you believe your ball is lost in a hazard? Or excuse me, lost in a immovable obstruction. That one always is. It's not. That is the rule that you are allowed to proceed and play your provisional ball, but it's not. But it's not really spelled out anywhere other than in a decision, right?
Well, I think in Rule 27-2 itself, it does talk about that, and the thinking's probably that that's the rule that deals with a provisional ball, so let's deal with provisional balls there. Would be my guess, as opposed to this, because I think to some degree, you could argue that this 24-3 to some people is a somewhat intimidating, complex rule, and to introduce something else to it regarding provisional ball might just add more confusion. And I think it's pretty rare that a provisional ball is played in a 24-3 situation to begin with. But really, as you just said, this rule, especially 24-3B, seems intimidating, but it's really not at all. You just the hard part is determining if there's enough evidence that the ball is in the obstruction. Once you reach that point, you just imagine the ball lies at the spot where it last crossed the outermost limits, and then you just take normal relief from there. Penalty for breach of this rule. So for all parts of Rule 24, let's think about different ways a player could do this. Well, under 24-1B, if a ball's on a movable obstruction, instead of dropping the ball, the player places it. That would be the general penalty. Under 24-2B, if a player drops and plays from the wrong place, or if he places instead of drops, or if he substitutes balls, that would be in breach of the rule. So let's look at some decisions. Decision 24/4 is a good one. Part of a boundary fence is bowed towards the course so that it's inside the boundary line. So imagine, say, a part of a chain link fence. Player's ball comes to rest against this part of the fence. Is the player entitled to relief? Answer is no. A fence defining out of bounds is not an obstruction, even if part of it is in the boundary line. So that actually comes up, can come up quite a bit. All right, decision 24-2B/2 is good because it raises the question that a lot of people will look at the definition of the nearest point of relief. They'll look at the procedure outlined in Rule 24-2B and say, gee, if I don't follow this procedure, I'm going to be penalized. Is that true? The answer is no, that's not true. that, as the first paragraph of the answer states, provide the ball is dropped on a spot that satisfies the requirements of this rule, and the ball did not roll to a position requiring a redrop, the player incurs no penalty. So in other words, the player is not required to go through the procedure of determining the nearest point of relief, measuring the one club length, and so forth. What will ultimately determine whether there is any penalty is where he drops the ball and where he plays from. As long as he gets those points correct, then there's no breach. Even if he purely lucks into dropping it in the right place, there is no breach. See, decision 24-2B/3.7 is good, is helpful. Among other things, it establishes that a player is not always entitled to a playable position, that a player's stance and lie of the ball may be more conceptual than some people think. For example, look at B3, the ball in the center of the path, upper middle of the path. Where is his nearest point of relief? What's the nearest point on the course where he could, that avoids interference and is not near the hole? Well, believe it or not, it's right in the middle of that tree trunk. Even though physically you might not be able to get to the middle of the tree trunk, that point is there, and that's the nearest point of relief. And just hope that the tree trunk is, the tree is, not some giant redwood. And the player can drop the ball outside it. Likewise, on the bottom, especially with ball B2, where a player's taking relief off the path, nearest point of relief off for B2 is P2. But people might say, wait a minute, how can that be? The player can't even stand there to play a right-hand stroke because of the boundary wall. But that is still the nearest point of relief. Now, in practice, what's going to happen if the player drops at P2? He's going to drop at P2, and once the ball's in play there, he'll say, okay, I can't play it right-handed. I can only play it left-handed. And to play it left-handed, he's going to be standing on the cart path, right? And then, because the boundary wall is so close to the cart path, where would relief for the left-hand stroke take him?
Behind the tree.
Yeah, behind the tree on the other side of the path. So then he would go to the other side of the path for that left-hand stroke, and then after taking relief, if he wants, he could certainly then play it right-handed.
He's staying on the path. B2 seems like a pretty good place to play from.
I asked this question in terms of when you're out setting up courses and what have you. If John Morissette came upon this picture and it was all stakes and there was no boundary wall, would you place those stakes along the left edge of the cart path?
Well, I mean, that's a good point, in that sometimes that is doing so in this case would certainly speed up play. That if you had the boundary stakes right along the cart path, then the player would never have to drop it at P2, and odds are at P2 you might have to drop it once or twice, maybe even place. So if the boundary stakes were immediately against there, then everybody would have to take relief to the other side of the path, which would speed up play. The downside is that if the stakes are too close to the path, then the ball that just dribbles off the path could go out of bounds, which in some cases might be too severe. But you're right, and that's a good example of how marking a course can help simplify and speed up play. Simplify rulings and speed up play. Let's see, decision 24-2B/9.5 is one we won't go over here, but it's a good one to go over because it establishes or reaffirms the principle of what determines relief is the originally intended stroke, and how sometimes you can have a new situation after you drop a ball and take further relief from that. Yeah, decision 24-2B/21. Player's ball is in bounds, but there's an immovable artificial object situated out of bounds. So maybe there are boundary stakes, but there's, let's say, a barn located out of bounds that interferes with the backswing. May the player take relief? Answer is no. That as that object is located out of bounds, it's not an obstruction. Therefore, this rule does not provide relief. So any questions on Rule 24?
I think in a related decision, that 13-2/1 is a really good decision.
13-2/20. What is that, the boundary stake?
Part of the fence off the course.
Oh, part of the fence off the course, leans across the boundary and interferes with swing.
What was that, 13?
It's referenced right at the bottom of that decision.
Yeah, and this actually, Phil, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this works well with that decision we looked at the start of 24, which was at 24/4. That part of the boundary fence bowed towards the course, and we said that, well, even if part of the boundary fence is on the course, the whole boundary fence is not an obstruction, so no relief. But then 13-2/20 deals with a fence that's not a boundary fence, but it's located out of bounds, and part of it's bowed onto the course. And as the decision says, that part of the fence leaning onto the course is an immovable obstruction. The player is entitled to relief. So what's different between that and 24/4? The 24/4, anytime you have an object that defines out of bounds, that entire object is not an obstruction regardless of where it's located. Whereas when you have a non-boundary fence located out of bounds, if part of it's in bounds, the part of it that's in bounds is an obstruction, and therefore Rule 24 applies.
With regard to Rule 24.1, with the local rule, stones and bunkers are deemed to be movable obstructions. Just if you could comment on that.
Oh, okay. Rule 24-1, we're really with a local rule, and it's a local rule we'll probably use for our state amateur this year, Aaron Hills, with stones and bunkers, saying that stones and bunkers are movable obstructions. So the point of the local rule is to allow a player to remove the stones and bunkers for safety reasons, as ordinarily you're not allowed to remove a stone or loose impediment from a hazard. And so with that, the key things are that first, you can remove a stone from a bunker, that if the stone causes the ball to move, as long as that move is directly attributable, no penalty, replace the ball, and so forth. The one thing that can come up occasionally is people say, well, what do I do if I see a clump, and I'm not sure if that clump is a stone that I'm entitled to remove, or if that clump is sand, which obviously is not allowed to remove. And the answer is, if the player is not sure and goes to remove that, what he thinks is a stone but turns out to be a clump of sand, well, he is going to be penalized for touching the ground in the hazard. So he needs to be careful with that. All right, on to 25. And 25-1, again, is very similar to 24-2 and -3. Remember, abnormal ground conditions definition: casual water, ground under repair, full cast or runway made by burrowing animal, reptile, or bird. So interference is the same with obstructions in terms of interfering with the lie of the ball, area of intent, stance, or swing along the putting green with the line of putt. The one difference is this note gives the committee the option to make a local rule saying that interference just with the player's stance is not considered to be interference under this rule. When might a committee do that? Well, let's say that a golf course is just overrun by rabbits or something like that, and they might think that burrowing animal holes and scrapes are so prevalent that they would that there's no point in giving players relief for interference with their stance. So they might adopt a local rule in that case. Now for relief. the first part of it through the green is the same procedure as we saw with immovable obstructions. Determine the nearest point of relief, drop within 1 club length of it. Bunker is where the relief procedure will vary and where there is a new or where there's a different concept that's not present in Rule 24-2. So if the player's ball's in a bunker and the player has interference, and the most common application of this is with casual water, he has two options. Without penalty, he can take relief as in the first clause, so determine the nearest point of relief, drop within a club length, except the nearest point of relief must be in the bunker, and the ball must be dropped in the bunker. But if complete relief is not possible, for example, if the bunker's so full of water that the player cannot get complete relief, the player must drop as near as possible to the spot where the ball lay, but not near the hole on a part of the course that affords maximum available relief from the condition. So in this case, the player will identify the spot that gives him the maximum available relief, the best he can do in the situation, which might not be very good, and then he will drop the ball at that spot, not within a club length of that, but at that point of maximum available relief. And as another option, in part because that last one might not be a very good one, the player, as with an obstruction, has the option of coming outside the bunker with a penalty stroke, keeping the point where the ball lay directly between the hole and the spot on which the ball is dropped. On the putting green, similar procedure, the player will lift the ball and place it at the nearest point of relief. And if complete relief is impossible, for example, if the hole is completely surrounded by casual water, in which case hopefully the committee would suspend play.
They're in the barn staying dry.
At the nearest position that affords maximum available relief. Same exception as we saw under 24-2 as to when a player is not entitled to relief. For example, if there's a puddle of casual water, if a player's ball's in a divot hole and he wants to argue that he's going to play a left-hand stroke so that he can stand in casual water, he'd have a tough case to make. But sometimes that might be possible, or that might be reasonable and necessary given the circumstances, such as with a tree that might force a player to play the ball left-handed. One point that glossed over, but just as we saw with an immovable obstruction, if a player's ball is in a water hazard, he is not entitled to relief from an abnormal ground condition. So he either has to play the ball or take a penalty stroke and take relief under Rule 26.
The ball, if the player is taking relief from casual water on a putting green, he has to place it, and if his nearest point of relief is off the green, he still places it.
Correct. All right, now 25-1C, ball in abnormal ground condition not found. So again, there's the requirement for there to be knowledge or virtual certainty that the ball is in the abnormal ground condition. And without that knowledge or certainty, the player must proceed under stroke and distance. Once that determination is made, the ball is considered to lie at the spot where the ball last crossed the outermost limits of the condition, and then the player would just take his standard relief, as we just saw. All right, and then on to Rule 25-2, but really instead of looking at 25-2, let's look at the local rule in Appendix 1 for embedded ball, which is on page 555. And I mention this just since in every tournament here in Wisconsin, we use this local rule, so you might as well look at this.
Pretty much in America.
Yeah, they're pretty much everywhere in this country. Through the green, a ball that is embedded in its own pitch mark in the ground may be lifted without penalty, cleaned, and dropped as near as possible to where it lay, but not near the hole. The ball, when dropped, must first strike a part of the course through the green. So, so there's several requirements here. The ball has to be embedded in its own pitch mark. And pitch mark has to be in the ground, not just in the grass, but in the ground itself. Ball may be clean and dropped as near as possible, so the player does not get a club length here. It's as near as possible. Exceptions: the player may not take relief if the ball is embedded in sand in an area that is not closely mown. So let's go through some examples of that. Let's say a player is playing a course that is naturally sandy, like let's say down a Pinehurst area or a coast course by the sea. If he hits his ball up into the sand dunes and the ball embeds in the sand, he does not get relief. But let's say now there's a course that has a bare area in one fairway, and that bare area is sandy, but it's in the middle of the fairway, so you have fairway mowers going over it, and the ball embeds in that sandy area in the middle of the fairway. He would be entitled to relief for an embedded ball.
But in that case, it would probably be marked as ground under repair. It's in the fairway.
Fair chance. But perhaps the more likely example of that is the sand-filled divot hole. Right. Where yes.
How do you define what a sandy area is? An example is up at the Bull, tournament up there on 16, up by the green. They splash a lot of sand out of there, and then the wall continues to kind of slide down. So you have spots in there that are very sandy with the ball will embed in. And yet it's not designed as the same.
Okay, so you're saying that you have splashes from a bunker that are almost creating a sandy area outside the bunker.
Yeah.
So is that a sandy area that if the ball embeds there, the player would not get relief? Well, I would say it's probably unlikely that a player's ball embeds there would not be entitled to relief, because under that, hopefully it's just a little bit of sand, there is earth, dirt, non-sand, in which case, clearly he's entitled to relief. But if over the years that really builds up and it's truly a sandy area outside the bunker, and it's not grass covered, it's just a bare sandy area, then you wouldn't be entitled to relief. Ball embeds there, and I suppose it is possible.
I don't understand.
That's the movable rule.
Yeah, and then that's a fairway more goes.
John, what's the rationale for the embedded ball through the green not being a part of the 25-2 embedded ball? I mean, is that an RNA?
Yeah, I think that the British Open is the one significant professional tournament that intentionally does not use this local rule. And for many years, the RNA has had philosophical concerns. They think when you hit your ball off the fairway, you should play it. And that especially when you play on links courses that have soft, sandy soils, that you often wind up with awkward lies, and that's just part of the game. But I think that it eventually that will be changed, and at some point, it's probably safe to say this will become the rule itself.
Am I misinterpreting the exception? Does that mean if your ball comes to rest in a sand-filled divot, and it's embedded, that you're entitled to relief?
It does. If your ball embeds in a sand-filled divot hole in the fairway, you are entitled to relief.
But it has to embed.
Yeah.
It probably does a lot of the time.
Does it have to be touching the ground underneath it, John, or what?
No. If it's
Even
just
a small little.
Yeah.
You lift it and look.
Mark it. Well, you kind of push it down before you lift it.
Oh, I just learned something.
All right, 25-3. deals with a wrong putting green, and it defines when a player has interference from wrong putting green. It's very straightforward. When his ball is on the wrong putting green, the interference does not include the stance or area of intended swing. So once it's determined, so if the player's ball lies on the wrong putting green, he must not play the ball. He must take relief. So to take relief, you'll lift the ball and drop it within a club length of and not near the hole than the nearest point of relief. The nearest point of relief must not be in a hazard on a putting green. The ball must first strike a part of the course at a spot that avoids interference. The ball may be cleaned. So keeping in mind that you don't factor in the player's area of intended stance or swing, whereas the nearest point of relief is often going to be just off the putting green, isn't it? So the player then has a club length in there. So penalty for breach of this rule, several possibilities. For example, if the player plays from the wrong putting green without taking relief, if he drops and plays in an improper manner or from a wrong place, if he, say under 25-1B, if he substitutes balls, if he plays from the wrong place, if he places instead of drops.
We have a terrific question with regard to Rule 25-2.
Okay.
If a ball was embedded in a sand-filled divot, is it reasonable to expect that the dropped ball first hit the sand-filled divot when dropped?
All right, so if we have a ball embedded in its own pitch mark in a sand-filled divot hole, is it reasonable to assume that when the player drops the ball that it will first strike the sand in the sand-filled divot hole? I would say not in every case. Because certainly there can be some very big divot holes where dropping as near as possible would have the player keep it in the sand, but there can be smaller ones where a ball could be at the edge of one where an inch to the side could be turf. So I think they just vary from situation to situation.
Which leads me to another question. In the discussion of as nearly as possible, where's John Morissette's gray line?
In inches.
No, I'll give you centimeters, Dan, but not inches. What's as near as possible? I mean, to me, 6 inches satisfies that requirement. I think beyond that, you feel like the player can do better. So I would say by around 6 inches. Is that?
And I don't mean, but I know that's a question that you'd like to leave as vague as possible.
No, yeah, but since I don't work for the WSGA anymore, I can give specific distances.
But Bill, isn't that what you want the WSGA rules officials to be consistent on?
Yeah, and that's why I asked it. I was telling John the story when the Tiger Woods thing happened. To my wife's credit and discredit, she jumped up off the couch and said, "Oh, well, why don't you just flip to the decision that describes as nearly as possible?" And I remember I reached over, grabbed the decisions book, and said, "Let me know when you find it." And went out to watch.
No, but that's one reason. I know many of you are strong advocates for work in simplegolfrules.com. But that is one of the concerns with the current rules is the various distances involved. You have as near as possible, you have 1 club length, you have 2 club lengths, you have drop behind. So isn't there room for just uniformity with all of that? And really, philosophically with this, you can understand, okay, with an embedded ball, you're just taking relief for this 1.68-inch area. So there's no reason for you to go a club length away, but for the sake of simplicity and having a nice clear line, why not allow the club length, for example? All right, let's look at the some of the decisions under 25. See, 25/18. We may have touched on this earlier with the definition of ground under repair, but this does come up occasionally. The status of a hole made by a hazard stake, that is a hole made by a greenkeeper and therefore automatically ground under repair, and the player's entitled to relief from that as long as his ball does not lie inside the water hazard. We mentioned how because of this, some committees, when they both use lines and stakes to define water hazards, will put the hazard stakes outside the lines to ensure that if a stake is displaced, that its hole would be through the green. Therefore, if a ball winds up in it, the player would be entitled to relief. I think that might be a little overkill, might confuse some players, and I think in general it works well just to put the stakes on the line. Decision 25-1B/2 is helpful. It has diagrams, and remember on the next page is the diagram for a right-handed player's relief. While the example given uses ground repair, the same principle applies, let's say, to a cart path. So it helps determine the nearest point of relief, and it shows also does a good job of showing how the player's stance affects the nearest point of relief. And by looking at these two decisions, for example, we can see how if the ball is right in the middle of the ground under repair, that Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson would take relief in different places. That Phil Mickelson would take relief, as we see here, if the ball were right in the middle of the ground under repair, where would Mickelson's relief take him?
Right.
To the right. And where would Tiger's relief take him? To the left. But it's a good one to walk through just the mechanics of determining the nearest point of relief and then the area in which the player's to drop.
Another good question here with regard to as nearly as possible. You mentioned the gray area might begin around the 6-inch area for dropping. And the question is, with regard to placing, would your answer be different?
With regards to placing,
the question is, if 6 inches is good for dropping, how precise do you have to be for placing?
well, I would say it's a question of replacing the ball. That if the ball's been moved and you have to replace it,
Exactly.
especially say through the green, then you have to know the spot. That there really isn't a margin for error. That you need to know the spot, and if you don't know the spot, then you're going to estimate and drop. Now, I'm trying to think of other situations where you're trying to place a ball, even if you don't know the exact spot. Well, you could have a case on the putting green, I suppose, when you're proceeding under maybe 26-1A.
Like Tiger did at Augusta,
you know,
13.
Where, but again, that's a case where you're just going to do
Estimate
the best you can and place the ball right at that spot. In that case. Well, let's see. Decision 25-1B/7 is good as it ties into some of our Rule 20 discussions. Player's ball is in casual water in a bunker. He elects to proceed under Rule 25-1B, so now he's taking relief without penalty inside the bunker, and determines the nearest point of relief in the bunker is close to the back. He drops his ball within 1 club length of the nearest point of relief on a slope outside the bunker because, naturally, he fears it will plug in the sand. The ball rolls down the slope and comes to rest in the bunker, not near the hole, then the nearest point of relief. Is the player subject to penalty? The answer is yes. This is a good example that even though where the ball wound up was a good spot, where the ball first struck a part of the course was not. So therefore, this was not a valid drop. So remember the two components, where the ball first strikes a part of the course and where the ball finishes. And in this case, the player did not satisfy the first requirement. So again, a lot of these situations are covered under the Rule 24 decisions also, because in many cases there's a good carryover between the two. Let's see, decision 25-2/0.5 has a helpful diagram that talks about when a ball is embedded in ground. So it makes a distinction between being embedded in ground versus just nestled in the grass, for when a player is entitled to relief. Decision 25-2/2.5 is a good one for officials to know that it exists and to know the procedure. That sometimes when you're playing on a really wet day and you don't quite have casual water, this tells us what to do if a player taking relief in the ball embeds when dropped. Answer: if the ball embeds when dropped and embeds again when redropped, the player may place the ball as near as possible to the spot where embedded when redropped, but no penalty. So, and this is in there just to make sure that the player doesn't stand out there dropping for the rest of the day. So, any questions on Rule 25? Yeah, Gene.
25-3/1, wrong putting green. Our course has a hole 10 and 14, which is a dual green.
Okay.
And it has a big swale in between the two greens. So if you're hitting a shot to the right on number 10, it goes to the right, it'll probably roll down and go towards the closer to the other green. Ditto the other way.
Okay.
So there was a college tournament out there, and so apparently they wanted to separate those greens, so they put a red mark on each side to distinguish the line between the two separate greens. And so that line remained there. The following week, there was some club matches going on. And apparently one of the players observed or watched this college match, and he saw this. So one of the guys hit the shot and went down, and it went just to the other side. So he said, "We got to take your ball off the green. You're on the wrong playing." I don't know. We've been like this all year. He said, "Well, there are red marks right there." So he did. He took the ball off, dropped it on the high grass, and proceeded to make double wood, move the hole. He didn't challenge that. But then after, in the discussion in the grill room, that came up, and the pro was there, and he said, "Well, who put those red marks in?" The pro said, "I did, because I was asked to by the committee." And he said, "Oh, well, is that the way we're going to now play the golf course? With that?" And the pro said, "No, I don't think so. It wasn't. It hasn't been. I just did it because of the tournament." And so now the question is, this fellow lost his match, went down because of that hole there like that. And he did not make the challenge at the time. He had a question on it, but he didn't say, "I'd make a challenge on that." And so I was just wondering, what?
So, well, I think the question is that in a tournament, a committee divided a double green with some red marks, and then after the tournament, some members were playing, and there was a debate as to whether the putting green was one or two greens. And I think in that, the key is that the red marks on the ground do not by themselves mean anything. There needs to be a local rule really saying the red marks on 10 and 14 divide those two greens. So if there's not a local rule in effect, then I think they're one green. It's a little bit like a dropping zone. That if a player comes across a dropping zone painted on a forward tee, unless there's an entry on the local rule sheet saying hole number 4 is an additional option for ball in the water hazard and use the dropping zone, you can't use the dropping zone. So I think it's a little bit similar to that. So I think without a local rule in effect saying those are two greens, then who knows? It could be the superintendent may have put those dots down just for mowing patterns or something like that. So
the pro asked me whether or not he should put a statement on the bulletin board indicating that this green is not two separate greens; it's a continuous green. And I say, well, basically, no. The local rule should be for the opposite if they're going to separate the greens.
Yeah, I agree that if the intent is just to play them as one green, then you don't need to do anything. But if the intent is to play them as two separate greens, then somehow need to mark them, and there should be a local rule somewhere saying that.
Well, I decided to match. That's all.
The greens at St. Andrews are considered one, not separate, correct?
Correct. Spring green. All right.
9 and 18, right? There's one at Rolling Meadows.
All right, well, why don't we, so we've got 40 minutes, so why don't we go ahead with Rule 26, and that will be it for the day. So Rule 26 discusses relief from water hazards. And rules, and first we'll look at just kind of standard relief, then 26-2 throws a couple of wrinkles in there. And often with proceeding under Rule 26, the most difficult part is just determining if there is knowledge or virtual certainty that a ball is in the water hazard. And there's a good decision, 26-1/1, that offers some help with that. And it's important because if you don't have knowledge or virtual certainty that the ball is in the hazard, then the player is required to proceed under stroke and distance. So naturally, it's in his interest for there to be a knowledge of virtual certainty. First point is to appreciate that knowledge and virtual certainty are different, or two concepts. It's not one concept. The knowledge, as discussed in the second paragraph, is when you know for certain, absolute certainty, that the ball is in fact in the hazard. For example, people see the ball go into the water hazard and so forth. And then, as the third paragraph says, in the absence of knowledge the ball's in the hazard, there needs to be virtual certainty the ball's in the hazard. And virtual certainty does allow for a small degree of doubt about the actual location of the ball. And then this next sentence is especially helpful. However, virtual certainty also means that although the ball has not been found when all readily available information is considered, the conclusion that there's nowhere that the ball could be except in the water hazard would be justified. So as an official, that's a good way to look at it, is to look at the situation and say, gather all evidence, all information, and say, okay, is there somewhere else the ball could be? So, for example, you could have a case where you have a pond in the middle of the fairway. There's nothing but closely mown, firm grass all around it. Nobody saw the ball go in, but by default, because there really isn't anywhere else the ball could be, there could well be virtual certainty the ball is in there. But if you have other situations with a pond with tall grass, with soft earth, out of bounds, trees, bushes, and the like, then that's going to decrease the chances of there being virtual certainty in that situation. As the next paragraph goes on to say, in determining whether virtual certainty exists, some of the relevant factors area to be considered include topography, turf conditions, whether it's firm or soft, so the ball could just be embedded in the soft turf, grass heights, visibility, weather conditions, and proximity of trees, bushes, and so forth. So once the player, or once it has been determined that there is knowledge or virtual certainty of the ball is in the water hazard, this is how the player may proceed. First, unless it's an environmentally sensitive area, he may play the ball from there. But if he doesn't play it, these are his two or three relief options, all with a penalty stroke. First is to proceed under stroke and distance to return to the spot of the previous stroke. Now, the second is to drop a ball behind the water hazard, keeping the point where the ball last crossed the margin of the hazard between the hole and the spot on which the ball is dropped. And then clause C contains two options that are available only for lateral water hazards. So if it's a yellow water hazard, the player has only options A and B. If it's a red lateral water hazard, the player has A, B, and C. And especially with lateral water hazards, don't forget about option B, because sometimes option B can be a better option than C. For example, imagine a hole that has a sharp dog leg around a pond. The pond's defined as a lateral water hazard. Player hits his tee shot into the pond. If he uses the 2 club length option, he's probably going to be dropped in the rough near the pond. But because if it's the hole's at a sharp angle, if he goes under option B and drops behind, he can get back into the fairway. So that might be to his advantage to do that. So option C has 2 additional options for a ball in a lateral water hazard. First, the most common one is to drop within 2 club lengths of where the ball last crossed the hazard margin, no nearer the hole. And then the second is to drop within 2 club lengths of a point on the opposite margin of the hazard, equidistant from the hole. And that second option is something you don't see that often, but it's good to keep in mind because occasionally that can yield a great result. And that second option is really there to help the player in a case where without it he might have to use stroke and distance. For example, imagine a hole that has a lateral water hazard running down the right side, and just beyond that, let's say there are houses that there's out of bounds. Player, it's a wild tee shot, lands right of the hazard, lands out of bounds, and kicks into the hazard. So it enters from the out of bounds side. So stroke and distance takes him to the tee. Option B doesn't exist because that would be out of bounds. Option C1, the 2 club length option within where the ball last crossed the hazard margin, doesn't exist because that would be out of bounds. But this last one allows him to come back to the fairway side of the hazard and take relief, and basically allows him to do something other than proceed under stroke and distance. So it's
equidistant, though. It can't be further from the hole.
That's right. Can't be nearer. It can't be farther. It has to be the same distance. And that's one way that, say, rangefinders can be helpful. That both players and officials. That sometimes official, if you're going to be on a hole in a day with a lateral water hazard, you might get out there early and say, okay, I know that if a ball last crosses the hazard margin here, that this point on the opposite side is equidistant. So you can have that in your mind before any players come there, so you don't have to make that up and waste their time while you make a ruling. All right, Rule 26-2 is another rule that at first glance it looks like a long, complicated, intimidating rule, but fortunately it really is not. And we've got a decision that helps with that. But really, once you get through it, it's really pretty straightforward. And I'm not just making that up. So we'll look at 26-2A first. If a ball played from within a water hazard comes to rest in the same water hazard or another water hazard, the player may proceed as follows. And for simplicity, let's assume it's the same hazard. So the player tries to hit it out of the wetland and he leaves it in. Well, he can proceed he has all his options that we just covered under 26-1 because his ball lies in a water hazard, so 26-1 applies. So where would the stroke and distance option take him? Right where he just played from. So that might not be a good idea, but that is an option. Option B, dropping behind the spot where the ball last crossed the hazard margin, which could well be from the previous stroke, is an option. So he can come out directly for 1 penalty stroke. Then if it's a lateral water hazard, he has the 2 lateral water hazard options as well. And the only part with A, there are really, in the new part for the situation not contained in 26-1 is under clause 3 at the top of page 411, that the player may, for just 1 penalty stroke, play a ball as nearly as possible at the spot from which the last stroke from outside a water hazard was made. So, for example, let's look and keep your finger on this decision 26-2/1, where the player plays from the teeing ground to point A, and then from point A, he hits the ball to point X. So what are his options? Well, 26-1, and this is a yellow water hazard, so he doesn't have the lateral options. Rule 26-1A would take him back to point A. Rule 26-1B for 1 penalty stroke would take him along dashed line EE. And then the additional option that Rule 26-2 provides is to let him go back to the team ground. So bottom line is he can come out of the hazard for just 1 penalty stroke. And the one time that the player runs into trouble is, and it should be somewhat rare, is if he drops at point A. If he uses the stroke and distance option, but then does not play from point A. If he wants to take subsequent relief, he can do so, but it would involve 1 more penalty stroke. So keep in mind that if the ball lies at point X, right away the player could come out the line EE or return to the team ground for a total penalty of just 1 stroke. But if he drops at A and then wants to come to EE or the team ground, that would be for an additional penalty stroke for a total penalty of 2 strokes. So it's a 1 stroke risk to drop the ball at point A. Now, let's look at the other situation with ball B. Player hits his tee shot to point B, and then from B, he hits the ball out of bounds to point Y over the green. So what are his options? Well, we know for sure that what? There is no avoiding the fact that the player has a penalty stroke for going out of bounds. So at a minimum, the player is going to have 1 penalty stroke for out of bounds. So then what can he do? Well, what would the out of bounds rule have him do? Out of bounds, stroke and distance would just have him drop at point B. So he could do that for 1 penalty stroke. But what if he wants to come out of the hazard? Well, he can. He could come to line FF. He could come to the team ground. But in those situations, though, the player would incur 1 more penalty stroke for coming outside the hazard. Why? Because now he's taking relief from 2 different things. He's got out of bounds for 1 penalty stroke, and there's no getting away from that penalty stroke. But then if he wants to take relief from the water hazard as well, then he has 1 penalty stroke to do that. And where this can differ a little, aside from the total penalty count, can differ from the other example with ball A, is that since the player is obligated to incur the penalty stroke for going out of bounds, there is no risk for dropping a ball at point B inside the hazard, because he has earned that penalty stroke no matter what. If he drops at point B and the ball winds up in a foot of water, and then he wants to take relief outside the hazard, then he can do that for 1 more penalty stroke. But there's no real downside to trying to drop the ball at point B in that case. So that's it. And this decision is helpful. The one on the opposite page, 26-2/2, just deals with a little bit of a twist. When the player hits the ball from within the hazard, leaves in the hazard, the ball had exited the hazard during that time, and also that it's a lateral water hazard with some additional relief options. But 26-2/1 does a nice job of walking us through the rule, and after reading that, then if you go back and read the rule, which is something people used not to do, but the rule actually makes sense. It could be perhaps organized in a more understandable way, but the rule makes sense.
Let's go to this again.
Okay.
He hits the ball from B to Y.
Okay.
He then drops the ball at B, and then drops the ball at F. Or if he just goes straight to F, it's the same thing?
No, there is a difference. With ball B, if he just goes to B, that's 1 penalty stroke. If he goes to B and then goes to F, or if he just goes from Y directly to FF, then it would be 2 penalty strokes. And the reason is there are two different rules involved. That he has.
Okay, I get it.
Okay.
He hit a ball out of bounds, penalty stroke.
Mhm.
No,
Taking it out of the hazard, another penalty
Yeah,
stroke.
exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
so,
If ever there was a great rule for a rules official to know, it's this. Because the player that gets into this situation
Hasn't got a clue.
definitely is going to be under a great deal of stress. I've done it. You were there, Gene. And I'll tell you, this is one to know for sure. Basically, it's a regression rule. It gets you out of the hazard, and it is one that a rules official should know for sure.
John, is one of the keys is that when he strikes the ball out of bounds from point B, 27-1, he has to drop the ball there, right?
Oh,
He
he
cannot directly go out.
Oh, he could. He doesn't.
Yeah, well, it's going to cost a stroke in the case. I'm just saying.
You don't have to.
Yeah,
you don't have to.
Yeah.
You don't have to.
Yeah, he doesn't
That's all I
have
want
to
to
drop the ball at point B. If he
Okay,
just
I
wants
just
to
wanted
come
to-
out immediately.
so it doesn't
we
make
can-
any difference whether he drops it or not. It's the same number of strokes,
Right.
provided it is in play from point B the
Correct.
second time.
Exactly.
Now, if he takes it, drops it at B, gets a little unlucky, and it's not a very good lie, so he figures he's got to go out.
Yeah.
There's no problem.
Yeah.
No, it says he doesn't have to.
All right, so let's look at some decisions. 26-1/1 we looked at. And then what we'll do, and Tim, this will tie into your earlier comment or observation about how sometimes players that do more wrong get a better break. But let's look at the number of decisions starting with 26-1/3. And we'll go through them because they're helpful to know, and these situations do come up. So first situation, 26-1/3. A player believed his ball has come to rest in a water hazard. Searched for a minute, did not find it. He therefore dropped another ball under Rule 26-1 and played it. Underline that it's important in this decision he plays it. He then finds his original ball outside the hazard within 5 minutes of having begun to search for it. What's the ruling? Okay, well first, what's the status of the original ball? What's the status of the substitute ball? Substitute ball is in play, and the original ball is off. So we know he can't play the original ball. So then, what's the question? And the question is intentionally vague on the facts. That was their knowledge of virtual certainty that the original ball was in the hazard? And the answer is broken down along those lines. If it was known or virtually certain that the original was in the water hazard, then the player was entitled to invoke this rule. So therefore, what does he do? He continues with that ball. But if there was not knowledge or virtual certainty, then he was required to do what? Proceed under stroke and distance. And he did not play from the correct place under stroke and distance, and we don't know where he played this from. Let's say it was from the team ground. Then match play is played from a wrong place, so he loses the hole in stroke play. He has a stroke and distance penalty plus 2 penalty strokes for playing from a wrong place. Then the committee needs to determine if it was a serious breach. And if, say, this was a tee shot, this likely would be a serious breach, in which case he would be disqualified unless he corrects the mistake in a timely manner. So with this decision, player actually plays the ball, and then we have the different answers based on whether there was reasonable or knowledge or virtual certainty the ball was in the hazard. Now let's change the facts a little bit. In the next decision, /3.5, player's ball is struck towards a water hazard. It is known or virtually certain the ball's in the hazard, and he drops a ball under Rule 26-1B. Before he plays the drop ball, the original ball is found within the 5-minute search period. What's the ruling? Okay. Has this player done anything wrong? The answer is no. That because he had knowledge or virtual certainty, he was allowed to drop under Rule 26-1. So he has proceeded in accordance with the rules. And he will continue with that the substitute ball and may not play the original ball. The one wrinkle to this is what if in this case he has not yet played the substitute ball. What if the discovery of the original ball alters the reference point, where you say, oh wow, well if the original ball was found there, then it must have actually crossed the hazard margin 10 yards up. Then the player can correct the mistake and say, okay, I'm still proceeding under the water hazard rule, but now I know the ball actually crossed here, so I'm going to correct the mistake of dropping in the wrong place and go drop in the court using this reference point. So the player would do that. So in this case, the ball has been dropped, but has not yet been played, so he can correct the mistake. Now, what would be the ruling if the player played, then they find the original ball and realize it must have crossed the margin somewhere else? Then you say, well, as long as the player did his best to determine where the ball last crossed the hazard margin, that's okay. He made a judgment call with all evidence he had and information he had at the time, so fine. All right, let's look at decision 26-1/3.7. A player's ball is struck towards a water hazard and not found. It is not known or virtually certain that the ball is in the water hazard, but the player drops under 26-1B. Before he plays the drop ball, his original ball is found within the 5-minute search period. What is the ruling? Okay, so the key is the player did not have knowledge or virtual certainty. He has dropped but not yet played a ball under Rule 26, and the original ball is found within the 5-minute search period. So when you put all that together, what has happened? By dropping under 26-1B, what did the player do? He dropped under a rule that did not apply. Because you can't use Rule 26-1B without knowledge or virtual certainty. So if he dropped under a rule that did not apply, but he has not yet played it, what rule can help him out? 20-6. So he can therefore lift the substitute ball and proceed correctly. And what would proceed correctly mean in these circumstances? In this case, it means play the original ball, because that was found within the 5-minute search period, so that was not lost. So let's see. So the answer is the ball is incorrectly substituted under an inapplicable rule. Rule 20-6 applied, and the player would abandon the substitute ball and continue playing with the original ball. And if the original ball is in the water hazard and the player doesn't want to play the original as it lies, he could then proceed under Rule 26-1 with respect to that. Goes on to say, if the player failed to correct his improper procedure and played the drop ball, well, he's proceeded under an inapplicable rule, and decision 34-3/6 will tell us that the committee would assign Rule 27-1 to judge the player's actions. So now you say, okay, the player should have proceeded under stroke and distance. He should have played from, let's say, the team ground. Instead, he played from up here. He's played from the wrong place, and then the committee needs to determine if that was a serious breach of playing from the wrong place.
John, that word, known or virtually certain, is very difficult to interpret. I know I ruled incorrectly at a match play tournament at the Bog on the final hole, which is Dogleg Right, and it has a water hazard with a lot of high trees to the right. 95% of the players that struck the ball in that direction were in the water hazard because they couldn't hit this player enormous length and hit the ball same direction, identical, and it carried over there beyond. But when they got down there, they were looking within the water hazard and stuff like that, and now the question of the 5 minutes, to come up. And just at that point, somebody said, hey, there's a ball way up there, on the spot. And he said, yeah, that's my ball. What's the situation? And, I ruled that his ball was beyond 5 minutes, was lost like that. And obviously, now the question is where does it return? To the, the TD in the area or to a different spot. And I ruled that it was lost, and I think I ruled incorrectly. But the question was known or virtually certain as to whether or not the ball carried.
Back then it was reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with that, while it's still imprecise and to some degree intentionally imprecise to allow for, a judgment of all the circumstances in a given situation, the phrase known and virtually certain, I think, is more helpful than the old reasonable evidence was. And I think that the expansion of the decision 26-1/1 is more helpful and more specific than previous versions. So I think I think it's getting there. But as you said, Gene, you're right. There's still going to be some difficult judgment calls, and I don't think that you can write the rule in a good way to eliminate all judgment calls. Okay.
I'm not sure I want to hear the answer to this question, but based on what Gene said, I played a course that has it's tree lined along lateral hazards on at least half the holes. And so with regard to the definition of known or virtually certain, when a ball strikes the trees right near the hazard and you don't find the ball, I mean, there could always be an argument that it was stuck up in the tree or ricocheted across the fairway. So in a situation like that, where it strikes trees that are outside the hazard, but you don't find the ball, so likely it's in the hazard, but how do you apply virtually certain?
Well, if a ball strikes a tree, especially if the tree is outside the hazard, that's going to decrease, not necessarily rule out, but decrease the chances of having virtual certainty, because it is, as you said, one, the ball could become stuck in the tree, and also when balls strike trees, they do funny things, go to funny places. So just because you can't find the ball after it strikes a tree doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in the hazard. It can be tough.
Well, you're probably saying everybody's handicapped, but sure, it should be at least 2 or 3 higher.
I think
You're not talking about Jersey, are
with your buddies.
Yeah,
But it's a difficult one.
his course has 17 of the 18 holes have a lateral water hazard with trees just outside of the lateral water hazard.
Would it be possible just to remove the trees?
That's the way the course was initially designed.
Remove the
Now
water,
it's got
too.
about 10,000 trees.
If you spend all 5 minutes looking for a ball,
Okay.
can you say at the end of the 5 minutes that you're virtually certain that it's in the hazard? And it seems to me once you spend that much time, then you have a question. And you can't then proceed under the virtual certainty.
Well, I think Jim raised a good point. It's a little bit like that Sherlock Holmes line that once you eliminate what's impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, is the answer, is the truth. So if you can somehow rule out that the ball could be somewhere else, say, look, we know for sure it's not here, we know for sure it's not here, here, and since it's not in these other places, and we know with almost absolute certainty it's not in these places, the only place it could be is here. Yeah, and sometimes that procedure works, but not necessarily in all cases. That just because you search for 5 minutes does not by itself mean that the ball has to be in the hazard. Because, for example, imagine a hazard with a tall rough around it. You could search in the tall rough for 5 minutes and the ball could still be in the tall rough outside the hazard. So it can help, but it doesn't necessarily make it an absolute case.
what kind of trees make a lot of difference?
You ever had a lost ball?
Can't you?
Cherokee?
I've always said, when you know it's in there, tell me where it entered.
Okay.
You look up here, you look there, and you look there,
Right.
and now you say it's in there, tell me where you entered.
Okay.
Well, I don't know.
Well, you're right. And once you determine whether the ball's in the hazard, then there's a question of, okay, where did the ball last cross the hazard margin, which can be quite another debate. And so sometimes I've heard some officials say that, well, gee, I'm going to rule that there's not virtual certainty. When the player got up there, he was looking way over here for his ball. Well, maybe he was looking over here just to establish that the ball's not there, and just ruling out other places the ball could be, which is a legitimate way to approach the situation, I think. And then there are some officials who say, oh, well, he played a provisional ball, so obviously he thought there was a chance that his ball was lost outside the hazard. Well, just because you play a provisional ball, that doesn't automatically mean you're not going to have virtual certainty the ball's in the hazard either.
That statement in here about interpretation of virtual certainty, the fact that a ball splashes in the water is not ruled necessarily to be in there because they had a tendency to fall off. I know I was in a ruling, then I see this shot, the long shot, 200-some yard shot, and my eyes are calibrated to about 190. And I saw the ball splash. I mean, there's no question about it, it splashed. And so he said, "Did you see it?" Yeah, I said, "It splashed." Yeah. So he drops another ball, tees off, goes down, and when he goes down there where his ball splashed, it popped out and it jumped up on the green. And now the question is that ball is out of play because we say it was in the water hazard, yet it wasn't in the water hazard.
Oh, yeah, you're right. And we saw that at San Diego this past weekend, didn't we? On the 18th hole, ball hit in the water and skipped out. I forget if it skipped out of the hazard.
It was a high shot, too. It was just amazing that it popped
It
out.
crossed and went up to the edge of the green.
And then rolled back.
And rolled back and it just on
They
the
just
line.
amazing.
Come down like that?
No.
It was a turtle under there.
It was a 5-wood.
Yeah, it was high.
All right, now it's followed up with 26-1/4. Player's ball carried over a water hazard and some trees. Couldn't be determined whether the ball bounced back into the hazard or came rest in the trees, so there's no knowledge of virtual certainty. He assumed his ball was in the hazard, dropped the ball behind the hazard, and played that ball onto the green. As he was walking to the green, he found his original ball in the hazard. What's the rule? Okay, what's the status of the original ball at that point? It's lost, because remember, he's played the substituted ball. And he played the substituted ball without knowledge of virtual certainty, so he proceeded under an inapplicable rule. The committee will say, will apply Rule 27-1 to judge's actions. So they say, okay, if you have stricken distance, you've played from a wrong place, and then the committee needs to determine if there was a serious breach of playing from a wrong place. Let's see, here, decision 26-1/15. It's just a nice diagram that shows the relief options for lateral water hazard, and especially it shows how you go about measuring and determining the point on the opposite margin equidistant from the hole.
There's a question from the online part. And this must have happened at last year's State Open, but it's the 18th hole at the Bullet Pinehurst Farms. A player thinks he has hit his second shot into the lateral water hazard that fronts the green. So he drops another ball under Rule 26. However, his fellow competitors and spectators can see his ball on the green. So he picks up the dropped ball. Given the spectators and fellow competitors' knowledge, did the player have virtual certainty when he dropped the ball?
Okay, so he hits his ball up towards the green. He thinks he's in the hazard. He drops a ball under 26, but then the spectators up near the green and see his ball, that his ball's actually on the green. They yell at him. They say, no, your ball's actually on the green. So he picks up his ball and goes to the green. Okay, well, in that case, the fact that someone somewhere knows the ball is elsewhere, that doesn't rule out that the player could have had knowledge of virtual certainty. It really comes down to, and it's a good question, but the key is the moment the player put that other ball into play, at that point, was there knowledge of virtual certainty available to him? And if there was, then he was obligated to continue with that ball. And if there was not, then he did the right thing by lifting and playing the ball on the green. So with that, again, the family and spectators, could be 200 yards up, but you might say, okay, based on what he knew at the time, was there enough certainty?
And if there was not, then he would continue play with the original ball on the green.
Correct.
But he obviously thought it was in the water, which is reasonably rapid.
Yeah, so,
Let's not get into
yeah,
that.
so it's an awkward situation for him because he either gets a good result of playing the ball in the green, but the only way he can get there is by saying, I really didn't think the ball was in the water, but I thought, what the heck?
Similar to my situation.
Yeah. So Tim, with that series of 4 decisions, what is interesting is the player, the player who has virtual certainty and drops a ball under the water hazard rule, and then his original ball is found. He can't play the original. He has to continue with that. But the player who drops without virtual certainty, and then his original is found within 5 minutes, he can go play the original, which you could argue, well, he did something wrong, the other player did something right, but the person who did something wrong gets a better result. And
And you think that the
rules.
disallowance of a provisional ball for a water hazard will ever be changed for speed of play? And there's a number of senior groups that play, and they incorporate that in illegally, obviously, and say, anytime there's a question, because he said, you guys can't see that far, like that. You don't know if it's in the hazard or lost or something like that. Can I just play provisional and then proceed speed of play?
It's clever, the association
There's a local
adopts a local rule.
Yeah, but if the local rule is not in effect, or in place, that's it.
yeah, and the local rule itself, talking about for a provisional ball in a water hazard, is not a great one, in that philosophically it does something the rules themselves don't often do, because it gives the player a choice. Well, you can either play this ball or you can play that ball. And as much as possible, especially in stroke play, you don't want to give the player a choice like that. And that there can be confusion as to when to use it and so forth. And it's certainly the goal to speed up play is a worthwhile one, but I think in practice, I think that local rule has just caused some people fits.
The biggest problem is how to interpret the rule
No.
after you've played the shot. Because most people think that after they play the provisional ball and they don't get a good result, then they can adopt 26-1. You can't.
No, you're right. You're right. So, all right. Well, any questions on 26? If not, I know Gary had a question about last time I'd like to talk about. But anything on 26?
Well, I know that the dropping procedure was altered in 1984 and 1988 decision, because originally the dropping procedure was saying that drop a ball behind the water hazard, keeping that point at which the original ball last crossed. And I remember I was a coordinator of a rule session, and it was Joe Black and DJ Boatwright and Mac England was saying there. So if that comes up to the point of where the ball entered, I can stand there and I can drop off to the side. The big tree here. If I drop over here, I can eliminate that tree. And DJ said, "Hell, that is not what that rule meant." He said, "Well, it doesn't read that." So in '88, they changed it and added the word "keeping the point" in there.
Well, I think the key is is not where you stand, keeping the point between the hole and where you drop it, rather than between the hole and the player.
That's what it now says,
Yeah.
but it didn't say that in 1984.
Yeah.
They said we'll have that change, and in '88 they added that keeping the point.
So, Gary, I'm sorry. What were your questions from the last session?
Before you get to that one, Rule 20, on page 326,
Okay.
the middle decision there. Could you explain what that last sentence means? Give me an example. Measuring club length.
20-2B/2.
Right.
However, a player may not measure through a natural undulation on the ground. Let's say that you have a rolling fairway and you have just a natural hill right here, and you want to go from here over to here. You can't measure your 2 club lengths right here. You have to measure along the contour of the ground, if that makes sense.
It would be hard to stick the club through the ground anyway, but you can't hold it above.
Yeah, exactly. That's what some people try to do, is hold it above.
It's just a surveying when you do all.
That's it.
Well, the question that we had from last week on our ride home, we all determined we were a bit confused on the 2 balls on a putting green, where player A and player B putt, and in one case, player A putts first and the player B putts second, and as to when the stroke is canceled, it has to be replayed by whom and who gets the penalty. We just kind of go through that.
Oh, okay,
Both
okay.
balls on the putting green and both.
And then one ball off.
Okay, all right, so the Madison contingent.
Yes.
had a
Oh,
lot-
no, don't throw me into that.
You'd be so lucky.
Oh, man.
All right, so is this dealing with playing while one ball's in motion or
Right.
not? Okay, all right. So let's go through it. Let's say Bill and I are playing together. Both balls are on the putting green. Bill is 30 feet from the hole. I'm 20 feet from the
This
hole.
is stroke play.
Yes, stroke play. Bill putts first, and he's away. While his ball is in motion, I putt. And our balls collide. So first, what's the ruling for my putting while his ball's in motion?
Not a good thing.
Not a good thing. I'm going to get 2 penalty strokes for that.
16-1.
Yeah, for 16-1.
Yeah.
And so that, but our balls collide. So what's the ruling there? Well, we're in each case, we had a putt, ball played from the putting green, deflected by another ball in motion after a stroke. So we both cancel and replay the strokes.
Because both your balls were in motion after a stroke from the putting green.
One shifting.
Well, first of all, let's switch it. So let's say, let's change the order of play. So Bill's 30 feet, I'm 20 feet. I putt first. While my ball is in motion, Bill putts. And somewhat, this might take some imagination, our balls collide. And in that case, is there any penalty regarding when we putted?
No.
There is not because it was Bill's turn to play, so he's not penalized for playing while my putt was in motion. And then we both, so there's no penalty to either of us. We both cancel and we play. So now, Tim, who's off the green?
Sometimes, just for the speed of play, somebody's chipping from, say, 10 feet, and then there's somebody else is 20, 25 feet away, and generally, instead of, we'll take you want the pin in, and if you do want the flag to stay in, we'll let him chip up. And if he's chipping up and his ball's in motion and somebody can't hear very well, he putts while that ball is in motion and they collide near the hole.
Okay. All right. So
Which happens, it doesn't, I don't happen very often, but we do that all the time just to, keep play moving.
okay. So let's say Bill's 30 feet from the hole on the green. I'm 20 feet from the hole off the green.
Right.
And I chip. And while my ball's in motion, you putt and our balls collide. Okay. First, in that case, is there any penalty for when we play? No penalty. And now our balls collide. So now we're going to wind up with different results since we played from different parts of the course. You, who played from the putting green, or Bill, is still going to cancel and replay his putt was deflected by a ball in motion. And I, who played from off the putting green, will play my ball as it lies.
No penalty.
No penalty. All right, well, I think we're about to be cut off. We got a tight 4-hour limit. So our next session will be next Friday, the 20th, at same time, 8 to 12, and we'll start with Rule 27, and we'll see how we go.
Thank you, John.
So thank you all very much. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, John.
I have an answer. We talk about the certainty of the ball in the water. Number 7 on the scene on the left side, right in the landing area. There's some rough, and then there's a little bit of the fairway, mainly rough. And my partner, the 2-man match football.
Wasn't his turn.
Hit a shot heading right for the water. And he gets up there, drops the ball, and hits it to about 3
Maybe the year before. He said,
So our opponent says,
That year before, it could be
I hate to be
January, that's when the golfers doing.